divine. Unlink.
Clouds high, the birds call.
Delve into destiny. Fate is upon you. Kamisato art. Sumetsu. Obey.
Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and updated Ayaka guide for her rerun banner in patch 2.6. Ayaka is one of the strongest and one of my favorite DPS characters in the game, being an amazing cryo character who can permanently freeze enemies and dish out crazy damage with many different teams and builds possible. And so in today's video, I'm going to go in depth on everything you need to know about Ayaka, surrounding how to play and build her efficiently. More precisely, I'm going to cover her best artifacts, weapons, teams, playstyles, constellations, and just so much more. Before we begin though, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, or as often as I can, so link in the description if you're interested. With that being said, I want to keep the intro short, so let's get right into it. So starting things off, let's talk about Ayaka's talents and playstyle so that you guys can get the most value out of her kit. First of all, a lot of her playstyle is defined with her unique dashes that will actually infuse your normal attacks and charge attacks with cryo. In fact, when Ayaka pops out of her unique dash, not only will you apply cryo onto enemies, but you will also infuse your attacks with cryo. Because of that, your Ayaka's attacks will basically all be cryo, allowing you to spam your charge attack and do pretty good damage, as well as permanently freezing enemies when paired with a Hydro support. On top of just that though, your dash actually does more because through a passive talent that you have, it will also restore some stamina for you, allowing you to spam charge attacks more easily and also give you 18% cryo damage bonus for 10 seconds. This buff happens when your Ayaka pops out of her dash, which is very convenient for dashing around, dash canceling, or even just buffing your Ayaka in general, which is something you should do as early as possible, especially in order to increase your damage before using your powerful burst. Now, while Ayaka's burst is in my opinion the main part of her kit, I do want to talk a bit more about her unique charge attacks that are honestly very good. What's nice about Ayaka's charge attacks is that not only are they cryo as we saw, but they are also ranged. They can even hit in something like Venti's burst and can just be pretty nice overall for a main DPS to have to sort of fill in the downtime between your burst, your skill, and whatever supportive abilities you're using. It's a pretty good source of DPS that you can easily spam, especially with the energy that's refunded from your unique dash. And another thing you should know is that you also increase your normal and charge attack damage after using your elemental skill thanks to another passive talent. Now with that said, let's talk about your skill and your burst. Your elemental skill is a pretty straightforward ability that just does AoE cryo damage around Ayaka. This ability is good for the cryo particles that it generates, as well as having a pretty decent scaling. It also has a pretty nice passive talent that we've already talked about, and so it's an ability that you should use pretty much on cooldown or whenever you can fit it in your rotation. Moving on, your elemental burst is an insane ability that is one of the reasons why Ayaka is so good. This burst unleashes a snowstorm in front of you with an incredible scaling on every single hit. In fact, as you can see, while the scaling may not look that big, this is how much you are doing on every hit, and this burst hits a lot of times. It is a total of 20 times or 19 times the cutting damage and then one big bloom at the end on a 20-second cooldown. The total scaling of this ability is insane. As you can see, at talent level 10, it will be over 200% on every single slice, and so the total scaling here is just insane, over like 4,000%, meaning it just does a lot of damage. What's even nicer about this ability though is that it can actually be AoE. Now, while it can be hard to group up enemies to actually do the AoE of this burst, if you lure enemies together and then freeze them, it will keep them in place for the whole duration of this burst, ensuring that all of this damage lands on all of the enemies. And a nice property to know about this ability, especially if you're not freezing, is that it's an ability that will move forward continuously until it hits an enemy, and then it will stop and start spinning there. Basically, you can just like launch this forward and it will chase an enemy and then stop when it hits one. And if the enemy manages to escape it, it will then start going forward again. Now, if you're not freezing enemies, this burst can be a bit wonky at times, as some of the hits could miss, and against enemies like Geovishaps, it can like displace them and just be annoying. But any of these inconveniences that I'm describing are completely removed when you freeze enemies, as you just have to ensure that you freeze them together, then use your burst, and then just make sure they stay frozen through your Hydro supports. And so this kind of explains what Ayaka's playstyle is, in the sense that she really shines as a freeze carry, as you not only gain a ton of buffs through like the Blizzard Strayer set and just a good team comp in general, but the freeze reaction allows your enemies to stay put in place, ensuring that you not only take no damage and have an easy time damaging the enemies, but also that you can get the full potential out of your burst on everyone that you're fighting. Now with that said, I do want to make it clear that there are other Ayaka teams that don't just rely on freeze against bosses specifically, or enemies that can't be frozen, like a mono crowd team or others that I'll cover in the team comp section. But in general with this character, my recommendation is that if you can freeze enemies and have the characters to do so, you probably should, as it is really strong. On top of that, the problem with running another reaction like Melt for Ayaka is that your Ayaka's burst will will only be able to melt around 6 or 7 hits of your burst because of an internal cooldown on its cryo application, paired with the fact that enemies can walk out of your burst or get displaced away from it, making it inconsistent and pretty much worse overall, on top of the fact that it needs more valuable supports like Bennett and Shangling. If that wasn't enough, it's also a lot of small hits back to back that your burst is doing, and melting a small hit isn't as significant as melting a big hit, as basically your burst is just hitting so fast that it's a lot of small hits that add up to a big one that is just typically less efficient overall. And so because of that, while I will cover it in more detail in the team comp section, I do typically recommend playing a freeze Ayaka, as that is how you get the most value out of her kit, and honestly playing Ayaka that way is just insane, and the damage you deal is pretty crazy. Also, it is important to note that your burst does have an 80 energy cost, which means you will need to fulfill that energy requirement to spam your burst on cooldown by running energy recharge on your Ayaka, and also pairing her with like a cryo support or a team that can help you fulfill your energy requirements, as your burst is very important. On top of that, you should know that your burst has a 5-second duration with a 20-second cooldown, so it does have some downtime. During that downtime though is when you're going to be using your Ayaka's charge attacks to deal some damage, and also and especially using your support characters efficiently to not only deal damage but also give some energy back to your Ayaka and to your entire team, basically making sure you can get all of your burst back. Now, other things to note are that her elemental burst does snapshot, which means it'll factor in any buffs you give it before using it for its whole duration. Because of that, you should make sure to buff your Ayaka with your supports or any buffs you have before using your burst. And for more advanced tips, I will have a small section on that a bit later in the video after we talk about her builds. Lastly, for your talent priority, you want to start by maximizing your burst, as it has just an insane scaling, and then your normal attacks, and then your elemental skill. Now moving on, let's talk about how to actually build your Ayaka. Starting things off with Ayaka's artifacts, her artifact sets are pretty straightforward. For a cryo character like Ayaka, you already have a 4-piece set that was designed for someone like you who can permanently freeze enemies and capitalize on the insane bonuses of the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer. Now, if you don't already know by now, the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer is a pretty broken set on any character who can utilize it efficiently. This is because the Blizzard Strayer set will not only give you a 15% cryo damage bonus from the 2-piece, but then the 4-piece is straight up overpowered, giving you a total of 40% crit rate, 20% against characters affected by cryo, and another 20% against enemies that are frozen. Because of that, for someone like Ayaka, who is typically played in a freeze team and who can keep enemies frozen for the whole duration of the fight, this 4-piece Blizzard Strayer is incredibly valuable. Getting a free 40% crit rate, which is the equivalent of 80% crit damage, as well as 15% cryo damage bonus, is incredibly valuable and what I recommend for Ayaka generally speaking. I do also want to take this time to say that even if you're not freezing enemies against bosses that can't be frozen, or if you're playing a non-freeze team like a mono cryo or others that I'll talk about, the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer is still recommendable, as you do gain 20% crit rate just against enemies that are affected by cryo, and so as long as you can keep enemies cryo affected, this 4-piece set still gets a lot of value from the 20% crit rate, while obviously being insane if you freeze. And so because of that, I pretty much always recommend this set. Now with that said, there are some alternative sets you can sometimes run. If for whatever reason you're running Ayaka in a team where enemies aren't affected by cryo, or if you just don't have a 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set, while I would recommend going and farming the set, you can mix and match some 2-pieces like, 2-piece Blizzard, or a 2-piece of an attack percent set like Gladiator, Reminiscence, or the new sets we got, or even a 2-piece Noblesse Oblige for 20% burst damage, which is pretty significant. Now moving on, let's talk a bit about what artifact stats you want on your Ayaka. Now for Ayaka, as with most DPSs, you're obviously looking to maximize your damage. In order to do that for Ayaka specifically, since you are generally running the Blizzard Strayer set, which gives you a ton of crit rate, and you also gain some crit rate from the Cryo Resonance, you will therefore need a lot less on your artifacts and can focus on prioritizing crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge. With that said, obviously getting crit rate on your artifacts is still good, as your total crit rate with 0 from the artifacts will only start at 60%, which is good, but obviously higher is still better. Now before moving on to the main stats you're looking for on every single piece, I do want to start by saying that the most important thing you want on your Ayaka is enough energy recharge to be able to use your burst reliably on cooldown, as it is a significant part of your damage. For the exact amount of energy recharge you need, this really depends on your teams and rotations. With that said, generally, if you're running another cryo character in a standard team, which we'll talk about later, you will want around 140% energy recharge. Do keep in mind though, this can be higher or lower for you, depending on how many cryo characters you're running, and also if you're running the Aminoma, a very powerful weapon that we'll cover in the weapon section. The reason why I have to bring this weapon up though, is because it gives you a lot of energy on its effect, which greatly reduces how much energy recharge you need, and can even at R5 provide you with enough energy in and of itself. Generally speaking though, 140 is a good ballpark, but it obviously does vary from player to player. Now for your main stats, you want attack percent on the Sands for a ton of damage, cryo damage bonus on your Goblet, and for your Circlet, it is quite variable, with crit damage being the most recommended option. With that said, there are actually situations where attack percent on the Circlet can also be a good option. In fact, while crit damage is typically the best DPS and the more recommended recommendable option, attack percent can sometimes be better if you already have a ton of crit damage or if you just have better substats. Do keep in mind though that a lot of buffs from your team are attack percent. Like a lot of characters on your team can give your Ayaka some attack, making an attack percent circlet worse and worse the more buffs you have. With that said though, since artifact farming is random, attack percent circlet can be a good option depending on your substats and can also oftentimes just be slightly worse than a crit damage circlet. And so I did want to mention attack percent circlet as a viable option, as with most Blizzard Strayer characters, since you're gaining so much crit rate on the set, like from the set effect, having attack percent can be important to help balance your ratio of attack and crit. In general though, a crit damage circlet is typically the best and what I recommend on Ayaka. Now with that said, let's dive into Ayaka's weapons. Now you should be happy to know that Ayaka has many different weapons that work well for her, both free-to-play options and 5-star options, so everyone can get a good weapon for their Ayaka. On top of that, I will include an exact weapon ranking in the section to help you find what's best for you. With that said, the first thing I want to say is that the Aminoma Kageushi is a really good free-to-play option that anyone can have access to. You can both craft and refine this weapon for free at the blacksmith for a weapon that gives you a lot of attack percent and a really good effect restoring your energy. What's so nice about this weapon is that not only is attack percent very important on carries like Ayaka, but also its effect will just passively give you some energy. The way this works is every time you use your skill, it'll give you a succession seed, stacking up to 3 times, and then when you use your burst, it consumes the seeds and gives you some energy. The exact amount it gives scales on your refinement, and it will therefore decrease how much energy recharge you need. Generally, this can lower how much energy recharge you need by around 20% at refinement rank 1, with it saving you somewhere around 40% at refinement rank 5, which can greatly decrease how much energy recharge you need on your artifacts, and potentially just satisfying your energy needs on its own. Because of that, this weapon is very good, and especially good the more you need the energy that it gives you. Its strength can therefore vary from player to player, but I do really like it as a free-to-play option, and generally as your best 4-star. Now, the only other 4-star weapon I want to talk about before I move on to 5-star weapons is the Blackcliff Longsword being just a good other option, typically a bit worse than the Aminoma overall, but if you don't need the energy or if you just want a crit damage weapon or have a Blackcliff leveled, it is also a good option. The main inconvenience with this weapon is that the passive can be hard to stack, and since your burst snapshots, it can be hard to buff your burst with this passive, but in general, it is still quite good. With that said, your best weapons are some of the 5-stars, the Mistflitter just being straight up your best option, as this weapon is pretty much just made for Ayaka. It has an insanely high base attack, crit damage on the stat, which in and of itself is amazing, but then it also has a really good effect, giving you elemental damage bonus straight up, but also even more every time you stack it, which you can do by normal attacking and using your abilities. Now, on top of just the Mistflitter, the Summit Shaper, for the insane amount of attack percent that it gives you, even if you're not shielded, is another really good 5-star. Following that, the new Huron Sword is very good, and lastly, 2 5-stars that are usually hated for Ayaka are actually pretty viable. The Aquila Favonia and the Primordial Jade Cutter, while they both, in my opinion, are better used on some other characters who can fully utilize them, they can also be pretty decent on Ayaka if you have them leveled. The reason for this is because the Jade Cutter is just insane for the stats it gives you, but the crit rate is typically wasted on a character who does run Blizzard Strayer. With that said, since Ayaka doesn't give you any crit rate inherently, and you only gain some from Blizzard Strayer and the Cryo Resonance, she starts at a base of 60% crit rate. While that is a lot, if you have none on your artifacts, or even if you're over capping on like 5 to 10% crit rate, the Jade Cutter can still be good and a viable option. Obviously, it could be better used on someone like Xingqiu or Jean or Keqing who could fully utilize all of its crit rate, but it is nonetheless still a good option for your Ayaka. A similar conclusion can be said with a weapon like Aquila Favonia, where yes, the physical damage bonus is wasted, and a lot of people think I'm crazy for saying this weapon is viable, and while I personally use it on another character like Bennett, who can fully utilize the high base attack to really make use of this weapon, it is still DPS wise a good option and similar in strength to a R5 Aminoma. The reason for this is because the high base attack of 674 and the 20% attack it gives you on its passive at refinement rank 1 makes it a viable option if you have it. Again, I don't recommend leveling this weapon for Ayaka. I would rather use it on someone like Bennett who scales off of base attack, but it is still a good option. To show you exactly what I mean with this weapon and just weapons in general, I will put a exact weapon ranking on screen now. Now do keep in mind obviously that this weapon ranking has assumptions as written, on the weapon ranking, and that the exact strength of weapons varies highly from player to player, from team to team, and depending on your artifacts. With that said though, this is a good way to get a general idea of how good weapons are as a bonus to my explanation. As you can see, pretty much all of the 5-star options are just really good, with the Aminoma being very good as well, and keeping up with most of the 5-stars that aren't like Mistflitter or Summit Shaper, and so it is a really good free-to-play option that anyone can use, so I do feel comfortable in saying that pretty much anyone can get a good Ayaka weapon. With that out of the way, I want to get into a bit more advanced tips for your Ayaka to help elevate your gameplay. First thing you should know if you don't already is that since your dash is so important and it gives that crowd damage bonus to your Ayaka and refund some stamina, it is important to weave it in your rotation. Because of that, things like dash cancels become very important. Since your charge attack has a very long animation, as you can see here, of just me doing it like normally, this is actually something you should dash cancel to cut down the animation. The way you do this is by just doing a charge attack and then dash canceling it immediately as the animation goes out. And as you can see, you can act faster and also get the passive from your dash. On top of that, you can also dash out of your elemental skill quite early, so do keep that in mind. Other things to note are that generally your optimal combo is going to be doing 2 normal attacks into a charge attack, or doing just a charge attack spam. Although generally for like stamina management, you want to do 2 normals and then a charge attack. A few other pretty simple things to note, but I feel like I should reiterate them, are that number 1, you want to make sure you're using all your buffs before your burst, as it does snapshot, as I mentioned earlier. So make sure to like dash onto enemies and use like your thrilling tails or whatever to buff your Ayaka, and then cast your burst. Something else you should know is that you can also, as with many other characters, use your skill and then your burst. And during the animation of your burst, you're actually going to get the particles, as you can see, that were flying towards you from your skill. Moving on, for Ayaka's Constellations, there are a few good ones, but Ayaka is a character that's so broken at C0 that you really shouldn't feel forced to get any of them. With that said, her first Constellation is not one of the good ones. It basically just decreases the cooldown of your elemental skill when you're doing your normal or charge attacks, but in practice, this doesn't really change how many skills you're going to use in a rotation, and while it can have some upsides, it really isn't that big of a deal through the testing that I've seen. With that said, your second Constellation can be pretty good depending on how you use it. Basically what this one does is it'll create 2 mini bursts alongside your initial burst when you do use it that will each deal 20% of your initial burst damage. The exact strength of this Constellation depends on what you're fighting and how reliably you can hit these bonus mini bursts, as I've seen them miss quite a bit, but I've also seen them be very efficient against like large enemies that you can freeze into place. Overall, it's a pretty decent Constellation, but not a needed one. Your C3 increases your burst level by 3, which is really good, and your C4 is honestly your best Constellation. This Constellation adds defense shred to your kit, as your elemental burst will now decrease the defense of opponents hit by it by 30% for 6 seconds, which is obviously just a pretty huge DPS increase. This can therefore skyrocket your Ayaka's damage and also buff your other party members' damage if you swap into them fast enough while their defense is decreased. Moving on, your 5th Constellation increases your skill's talent level, which isn't that important. And lastly, your C6 is pretty okay, but not like the most life-changing, as it'll basically just give you another burst of damage once every 10 seconds when you use your charge attack. And while this Constellation will increase your damage, and so if you have it, obviously it's nice, it isn't the most crazy C6 and not one I would recommend pulling for if you're just trying to pull for like the best C6. Overall, Ayaka is someone who has pretty decent Constellations, especially with her 3rd and 4th one, but really is not dependent on any and is really amazing at C0. Now with all that said, let's get into one of the most important sections of this video, talking specifically about Ayaka's teams. As I've made it clear throughout the video, Ayaka is someone who is typically ran in a freeze team, as it's really what makes her shine the most. While there are a few other teams that I'll talk about, let's start with her strongest teams, which are ones that can utilize the freeze reaction. These teams, while the characters vary and can be highly flexible, typically follow the same formula of a Hydro, Anemo, and Cryo support paired with Ayaka. You're running a Hydro character for the freeze, a Anemo character to buff your Cryo character's damage significantly and also group enemies, and then another Cryo character as a battery for more energy to your Ayaka and also to deal bonus damage and just have good synergy with the team as a whole. And while this team is one of Ayaka's best and my personal favorite for Ayaka, and I'll explain why shortly, Ayaka doesn't rely on 5-star characters. While Kokomi, Kazu, and Shenhe are 5 stars, there are much more accessible freeze teams like this one right here using only 4 stars, and another one even more like free-to-play friendly, albeit a bit worse. Now with that said, what specific supports do you want the most? Well, let's go element by element. For your Hydro supports, Kokomi and Mona are typically the most reliable ones for constant off-field Hydro application that will also give you a lot of damage through a powerful catalyst like Thrilling Tales or Favonius as like supportive catalysts, I guess I should say, and artifact sets like Millith or Noblesse Oblige can also be used. Kokomi also is a healer for your team, whereas Mona gives you more damage. With that said, other characters can work too. Ayato can work and be an on-field auto attacker, although even just his burst is enough to keep enemies permafrozen, so you can use them together. Xingqiu can work as well, although he is typically wanted in like your other team if you're doing the Abyss, as he's such a high value support that I personally don't use Xingqiu with Ayaka, so I can use him on another team, but obviously you can use him with Ayaka and he works very well. And lastly, Barbara is like your last resort Hydro option, but she's a free-to-play option that can heal you and can struggle a bit with uptime, but generally her elemental skill is enough to keep enemies permafrozen at least during your burst, since it does apply Hydro periodically to enemies around you. Now for your Cryo slot, Shenhe is someone who I really love with Ayaka, as your elemental skill on Shenhe will buff all your party members' damage. You can use Shenhe's skill to buff your Ayaka's damage damage up to 2 times per burst by using it before and during your burst, since it buffs you instantly. And so overall, when you pair that with her burst that decreases the cryo resistance of opponents, overall just running Shenhe and Ayaka together is a very strong synergy. Now obviously there are many other cryo characters that work. Diona is a very widespread used cryo character for Ayaka if you need a healer slash shielder, and also someone who gives you a ton of energy through her skill and a bow like Favonius or Sacrificial. More offensive cryo supports include Kaya for some nice damage and energy, Rosaria, whom I personally really like, for also damage and energy, but also a lot of crit rate from her passive. Lastly, someone like Ganyu can work in a more, I guess, Ganyu-centered team where you're using Ayaka and Ganyu's powerful burst together when paired with someone like Venti in a team that looks more like this one, where as long as enemies can be frozen and displaced, especially if they can get grouped up with Venti's burst, you can have one of the highest DPSs through just all of your bursts combined, making it a very powerful team comp. And lastly, for your Nemo slot, this is very important since all the Nemo characters can run the 4-piece Verdescent Venerer, which will skyrocket your elemental damage. You can actually use pretty much any Nemo character. Kazuha is typically the best to group up enemies efficiently, deal really good damage, and buff your team's elemental damage through his passive. With that said, other Nemo supports like Venti can be really good for displacing enemies and also giving you some energy thanks to his passive talent. Sucrose can be a good like 4-star Kazuha option, as while she'll give you less elemental damage, she'll give you access to the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and will also group up enemies. Lastly, you can use it in Nemo healer like Jean, but this will hinder your ability to group up enemies and lower your overall team's DPS when compared to someone like Kazuha. But if you need a healer and a Nemo character in one, Jean can still be good. Now with that said, if you're not running freeze for whatever reason, if you just want to play other characters, or especially if enemies can't be frozen, you're fighting like a boss or something, other teams like a mono crowd team can actually be pretty good. Running a team comp like this one, 3 crowd characters and an Nemo support, is very good and what you should be doing. Do keep in mind you don't need Shenhe for a mono crowd team and can use someone like Rosaria or just another crowd character instead of Shenhe, but obviously Shenhe is the best option generally speaking. Lastly, for reverse melt teams, while I mentioned in the playstyle section that I don't really recommend these teams for most players, this team will obviously still be viable and will still be able to like clear the abyss and stuff because you're pairing Ayaka with just pretty broken characters like Shangling and Bennett. With that said, I obviously will recommend using freeze over this team as it is just better overall and typically won't require as high value characters. With that said, I do believe this team gets a ton of hate, so I do want to at least mention it as being a viable option, although it obviously still isn't meta. As someone who wants to give you the best advice possible, I do believe I made it clear that I recommend a freeze team. This is how you should be playing Ayaka, with other teams like Mono Cryo still being viable and good, but freeze just being a broken reaction overall. Now with the teams covered, we're now going to move into my Ayaka showcase, where I'm going to be using a freeze team in the floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. I managed to get a pretty good clear just casually on my live stream using my Ayaka with a free-to-play weapon, the Aminoma R3 at Constellation 0, obviously, with talents 8, 6, 9, and very good artifacts. My artifacts naturally with all my characters are pretty good. I'm on 4-piece Blizzard Destroyer with a very good crit ratio, and so this is going to show off Ayaka's potential like a high investment Ayaka with a free-to-play weapon and C0. With that said, I hope the guide was helpful and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Take flight!
As one with wind and cloud.
Obey!
And so overall, as I'm sure I made it clear, Ayaka is an amazing and broken DPS who shines exceptionally in freeze teams with her extremely high scaling burst and powerful charge attacks. She's a character that I love and one of my favorite DPSs, and someone who I recommend using and pulling for if you like them and enjoy their playstyle. With that said, I hope this guide was helpful. As always, if there's anything new I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Apologies for the slight delay on this video, as I know it's a bit after the banner, but I did want to make sure it was thorough. But with that said, I don't want the video to get too long, so I'm going to end it right here. If you enjoyed, feel free to like and sub as it means a lot. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.